Hey dudes, what's happening? It's Trent here, and today I've got for you the Crushing Walls Hearthstone card artwork. I'm going to give you a little behind the scenes walkthrough of the sketches, sketch to finish. This card was just recently announced at BlizzCon 2017 by Ben Brode, who did a little walkthrough scenario with it, and it was very prominently featured, which is pretty cool. Pretty happy about that. It's always nice to see your work featured somewhere as a sort of a showcase. But this is my 70th or so Hearthstone card, so I'm no slouch. I've done a few of these. So let's dig right in. Let's get into the process of what goes into making a card for Hearthstone as an artist from the artist's perspective. All right, let's do it. So normally what happens is I'll get a phone call from the art manager on the project, and he'll say, hey, how many cards do you want to do for this set? Here's the style guide and the theme and what kind of monsters and what kind of setting it's going to be in. And I'll decide, okay, well, maybe I can take on 2 or 3, usually I do about 2 per set. Sometimes I skip a set if I got a lot of other work. Then I go about doing thumbnails. And in this case, I had a couple of kind of loose thumbnail shots from James Loy Martin, who I sometimes work with. He had done like the troll head and a couple of things like that. I'll usually do 3 thumbnails based on the description. They give you like a little sentence or a couple of sentences and a style guide that kind of says, here's what the kind of characters are wearing and that sort of thing. You turn in those 3 thumbnails, and then usually the art manager will pick one with a couple of changes. I had my assistant Danny kick out some color flats, and then the art manager made his selections along with sending me a couple of notes and a few directions on how to modify it. And in this case, like the likeness of the troll wasn't quite hitting the mark, and the likeness on the blood elf. There are some pieces like old Wang Wei pieces that the blood elf had pupils in her eyes, so I started doing like pupils in the eyes, and that came back as a big no. They just don't do that on blood elves anymore. Anyway, this was kind of a big throwback to some of my old stuff because I had worked on Burning Crusade, so I had done a lot of work with Blood Elves before in the past. But they've changed a lot, I mean, that's 10 years ago and things have changed. There's been a lot of different artists doing a lot of different interpretations of the characters. So it took a little bit to get, on point with it. I wouldn't say that this one is the most style matchy, which is kind of ironic because I tend to be kind of known for more stylization. Specifically, I get too close to the WoW style, and not every project I work on wants the WoW style, but just because I worked on it for so long. But now with this one, I actually went a little bit less in the WoW style, and it's kind of ironic because it's usually just not my flavor. It's not the direction I go. So there was some of the challenges here were with getting the colors to read clearly, and usually if you have a strong separation of cool and warm, you can get a good thumbnail read. The Hearthstone cards, it's very important to get a strong thumbnail read, so you want to separate using either contrast or hue. So, I like to think of it like temperatures. So if your foreground is really warm and you have a lot of like oranges and warm colors and the color wheel and your foreground elements, and then you have that against a very simple, cool green in the background, you're going to get a lot of pop on it, and that character is going to really pop out. But you have to balance out how much of that. I played around a little bit with reflective surfaces. She kind of has this metal kind of going throughout her armor. Even though it's kind of skin tight, there's still some of this sort of leafy shaped metal and filigree pattern work that's worked into it. And so I needed to kind of bounce some of that green light from the environment off onto her. And then as you'll notice that the troll is behind her, so he's actually getting a lot more of that atmospheric green bounced light, kind of bouncing all over him. It's kind of desaturating his warmth a little bit, which makes him feel like he's not as close to the foreground. A guy in the comments section on my channel here had asked the question, why do I put like swirls in everything? I put swirls in rocks, I put swirls in poofs of clouds. You see it all over the place in World of Warcraft. Where does that come from? A lot of it was inspired by old Brian Froud, kind of designs. If you're familiar with Brian Froud, if you're not familiar, he was the concept artist on a film called The Dark Crystal, which is a film that still holds up today. Is old Jim Henson kind of puppet stuff, but it was a little bit more mature and kind of trippy and just really whimsical, fantastical stuff. This film had a strong impact on me, and ever since I was a teenager, ever since I first started drawing, I kind of put these little coils in everything, and it's sort of like a symbol for the spiral of life as well. But I just kind of aesthetically, I like it, and I try to incorporate it into a lot of different things that I do. How much time did this piece take? I tend to not spend more than 10 to 14 or at most 15 hours on any Hearthstone card illustration. The primary reason for that is this is not my only gig. I jam these out pretty quickly, and I work with assistants to shave that down even more. So I technically only spend about maybe 7 or 8 hours on any given piece for Hearthstone. So let's dig into the dissectional. Let's talk a little bit about what's working about this piece and what isn't working about this piece. This is kind of where I like to kind of do a little breakdown of the lessons that I learned and things that you could maybe take away from this. So one thing, compositionally, you'll notice we've got this shape going here that really pops out our main characters. In fact, if we were to look at this at a thumbnail scale, very important with Hearthstone cards that you get a good read even at a thumbnail scale. And we just get this feeling that these forms in the middle are being squeezed by specifically, that's starting to look bad, specifically like by these arrows pointing in. This is all to support this idea that these dangerous elements are squeezing in from either side. And what else worked? So the challenge was with finding the appropriate hues for the skin tone. So a lot of times the Blood Elves tend to get this very kind of saturated look, and in some of my earlier images, they had a very saturated skin tone, but it was popping out too much. So I wanted to kind of like frame it with a little bit more of the shadow color. So one way that you can get the shadow color is to set your layer, and this will work in Sketchbook Pro as well, set your layer to darken, and then grab like a gray. This is actually a gray that's a little bit of this, it's got a little bit of that green to it, so that it's the bounce light from the shadow will actually affect the surface as well. And so you'll see how just by painting on a darken layer, I'm able to kind of form a little bit of the shadows here. And I could have made her whole face in shadow this way. This is a much better way to paint your shadows than to just do a multiply layer. You'll notice, look at the difference if I switch that to a multiply layer. That's just too much contrast, and it's not working. You don't want to necessarily have your shadows just getting darker. Sometimes you just want your shadows to be a desaturated, bounced light into your shadow areas, rather than it being something that just makes your contrast higher. Because then if the contrast were the same as this foreground spike here, for instance, then we wouldn't get that sense that it's at a different distance. You see, if all these elements got that dark. This is getting borderline close, and that was something that I struggled with while I was doing this piece. You could also go in, and once you've got some shadows, you can erase out some of your light as well. So you see how I'm kind of backing things off using a darken layer rather than using a multiply layer. So that was a cool takeaway from this. The specular on the troll's head all throughout here kind of gives them a little bit of like a wet look. One thing that you can always do is if you really want to make something look shiny, you can add like a strong high contrast little light to the edge that would be popping directly at you. Make sure this isn't on a darkened layer anymore. Make it a normal layer. So you'll notice here we're kind of creating a little bit of a specular, but make sure that everything that's got that same material, if there's a spot where that light is, if the form is round or it has dimensionality to it, it's going to pop a little bit more of a specular light at you. So that's what we're seeing on the eyeball here. That's what we're seeing here. And if you wanted to bump that down and make that more of a matte surface and less shiny, you would decrease the contrast on it. In this case, you could just erase that out. Something that I wanted to bring up that I feel like is very important is, and this is something I've been trying to apply to everything in my life, is to identify what is the important thing? What is the important thing about this piece? The important thing about this piece is that we get that the crushing walls. That's very important. So those have the highest amount of contrast. The second important thing is to see that these characters are a little bit more frightened. And that's a whole different video to talk about expressions and things like that. But they're not sure that they can survive. This was in the description, I believe it was, they said, think of the scene from Star Wars when they're in the trash compactor. You know, you've got these are the focal points, the important area. Whereas a lot of this, like, yeah, I put in some smoke just to, it wasn't to cover up the feet, but the feet they're not the important thing. The important thing is everything that's going on right here in the middle and what's being squeezed from the outside. You've got all of this energy pointing to them in the middle of the shot. Keep that in mind when you're doing your layouts, when you're forming your thumbnail. Like, what is the important thing? And make that where you put your energy. Don't put all of your energy into, rendering out the boot down here. You know, that's not the important thing. The important thing is what's going on here. And that's why we have this really strong light right behind her head, because that pulls your attention right to her face. And sometimes you got to play around with this, and sometimes you move your focal point. I did a Metroid piece recently where I flooded in this really strong red across the back, and it just ultimately, some people in the comments were like, I liked it before you added the red. It gives it a striking punch, but it distracts from the focal point of what's important about your piece. So keep that in mind with your piece. Overall, I was very happy with this one. Stylistically, I feel like it's a bit of a departure for me, but I'm going through some weird identity crisis with the art styles that I'm working with right now. I'm just trying all kinds of new, weird, funky stuff and adopting new techniques that I would normally never do. But I think it's an exciting time. It's also a frightening time because sometimes you got to fall back on your old comfort zones, you know, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next video. I want to thank you dudes for stopping by. It is a pleasure as always. I want to thank you especially for being so cool in the comments section. I read every single comment. It's been brought to my attention many times that it's unusual to see such a good vibes comment section, and all of that's you guys. I really appreciate you helping each other out when there's any information where, you know, I might have gotten something wrong, or somebody had a question and somebody jumps in to help them out. Dude, that's awesome. If you're watching my videos and you're hardcore and you'd really like to see my more real-time videos or some of my more specific detailed tutorials, you can swing on over to my Gumroad channel, which is, you can find that in the text field below the video, where I've got my brushes and a lot of the more professional tips for breaking into the industry and improving your portfolio and things of that nature. For everybody else, dudes, remember, if you're gonna draw the most epic, powerful Hearthstone card ever, draw the most epic, powerful Hearthstone card ever with some freaking passion, man. Ooh, yeah. Oh, it's a madhouse. It's a mad, mad house.